Hello and welcome to this LeapSense community call hosted by IFOL about ORCID repository integrations. And as you can see, we have 4 excellent speakers today. Gabriela, Mejias from ORCID, Daryl, Grenz from King Abdullah University of Science and Technology Digital Repository Lead, Marié, Roux, who is a Research Impact Service Manager at Stellenbosch University Library, and Roberto Barbera from University of Catania, and he's also from NADRE National Academic Repository of Ethiopia and also National Academic Repository of Somali. And if you want, colleagues, you could introduce yourself in the chat. Thanks for joining us. We'll start with presentations and then we'll take questions in the end. And if you could please use Q&A functionality for questions. Thanks a lot, and over to you, Gabi. You're muted. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can you see my screen?
Not anymore.
Sorry. Sharing again.
That also happens with me. If you're sharing a screen and then you mute or unmute, then there is a problem.
Sorry. Second webinar today. Are you able to see now?
Yes, we see your screen, but not the slides yet.
Sorry, let me try this. And I think you can now.
Yes, now we can see it.
Great. And yeah, so sorry, second webinar of the day, and I woke up very early today. So thank you so much, Irina, for the presentation. I'm Gabriela Mejias. I work at ORCID as the engagement manager for our global consortia. And I'm based in Berlin, in Germany, and I will share with you today an overview of some best practices of integrating ORCID in repository systems. And I'm moving forward to the next slide. To start with, before we dive into the best practices for ORCID integration in repositories, I just wanted to give you a quick overview on the ORCID APIs. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's basically a tool that allows institutions and any users, any integrators to exchange data with the ORCID registry. So to give you some basics around the ORCID API, it's a RESTful API, meaning it works with HTTP calls, and it uses an authentication protocol. It can be used with 2-legged and 3-legged authentication. The 3-leg authentication process means that the user needs to grant permission. And for us, this is very important because we have a user-centered approach to digital identity and to the ORCID identifier and the ORCID registry. So enabling authentication is a way to ensure that a user signs into the ORCID record and then grant permission to institutions, organizations, and integrators wanting to interact with that ORCID record. And by doing this, not only you ensure to collect the right ID for the person, but you're also respecting user privacy and consent. And it's also possible to exchange data with or in XML and JSON format, as well as RDF, gzip, and Turtle. And to let you know that we currently support 2 environments. So you can use the ORCID APIs in 2 different environments. The production registry, that is the registry where there are more than 11 million IDs and the associated metadata live. And you can also use a sandbox or testing environment, and you can use the same functionalities as in the production environment. And everybody is welcome to test the ORCID API in the sandbox registry by requesting credentials on the link on the top of the slide. And as you can see, we have 2 different APIs. The public API that's available to everyone, and it's free to use. And with this API, you can authenticate, meaning you can obtain an authenticated ID by implementing the API and requesting the user permission to obtain that ID and to interact with that ID. And you can also read or import all data on the ORCID registry that's marked as public. With the member API, we have 2 levels. The basic level allows the same functionalities as the public API, plus you can access a second visibility level called trusted parties, and this is represented on the ORCID registry with this key icon. So with the member API, you can obtain an ID, read or import public information, and read or import information marked as trusted parties. And you can also write information to an ORCID record, and you can edit or delete the items you have written with your member API credentials. And we also have a different level for our premium members. This has the same functionalities as the basic member API, plus you can register webhooks or observe IDs and get a ping whenever there's information or there's a change on an ORCID ID. For example, if information gets added, edited, or deleted. So you receive a ping, and then your system can query the API to see what changed on an observed ORCID ID, and then you can synchronize your systems accordingly. So with that basic overview of the ORCID APIs, sharing some recommended best practice, and these best practices are a result of a task force we established to elaborate recommendations for supported ORCID in repository systems. The working group was established in 2018, and it included 15 experts from many different institutions, and the recommendations were released in 2019. To give you a quick overview of the recommendations, the first one is collecting authenticated IDs, meaning obtaining user permission to obtain an ID and additional permissions to import or write data to the ORCID registry. We also encourage displaying those IDs collected. both publicly and also embed those in the outputs metadata. And to improve the functionalities of your repository, we also recommend to import data from ORCID into the repository, and also, and very important, to connect and share your data from your repository into the ORCID registry. And obviously, we encourage all our integrators to document the integration, how it works, why should researchers connect their ID to your repository, and share that information with the researchers or the contributors. And obviously for system or service providers, we recommend providing documentation for the administrators. So to start with the first best practice, or with the first recommendation, we recommend obviously collecting the IDs, and this can be done in different ways. So it's possible to, and recommended, and we encourage to collect those IDs with user interaction or authentication, meaning implement the three-legged OAuth protocol to obtain prompt the user to sign into that ORCID record, and then grant permission to the organization to interact with that ID. Another way of collecting IDs is mediated deposit, and this is when an authenticated ID is associated with a contribution, with an output, and the authentication has not taken place, but you have retrieved metadata that includes an ORCID ID. And the third way of collecting IDs would be via a third party import or deposit. For example, when the ID is extracted from metadata obtained via data site, for example, the ID could have been authenticated. And we recommend that for the second and third way, you indicate that the ID has not been authenticated, and we'll see more about that on the next slide. Here we recommend displaying those IDs you collect. So we recommend that you display this information publicly whenever the name of the person appears. If the ID has been authenticated, we recommend that you display it according to our guidelines, meaning that you include the green ID icon, followed by the ID, and hyperlinked to the HTTPS version of that ORCID ID. However, if you've obtained a non-authenticated ID, we still recommend that you display it, but that you add an indication, for example, unconfirmed or unauthenticated, or the equivalent in your local language, so that you show the community that that ID has not been authenticated. And these recommendations are for humans reading those IDs, but obviously and very important, we recommend that you include the ORCID IDs in machine readable metadata. And this is an example I think this example is from Crossref metadata, as they have the attribute ORCID authenticated equals true. But it's very important that you embed the IDs you collect in the output metadata, so that this information is available for other integrators that can reuse the information. And very important to obtain permissions to import data from the repository, from ORCID into your repository, or to share and write your data into the ORCID registry. If you want to import, you need to request permissions to read information. This can be done with the public API, and you can use the scope read public, meaning with the public API, you can collect permissions to read or import any data in the ORCID registry that has been marked as public. If you are an ORCID institutional member, you can use the scope read limited and import public data and data visible to trusted parties. And you can only access this data if the user has granted permission. And we recommend that you use the data you import to pre-populate your systems and forms to save researchers and contributors time. And we also have some recommendations to write data from your repositories into ORCID. You can, in addition to these permissions, you need here, and this can only be performed with a member API, and you'll need to include these scopes, activities update, and this allows you to write works into the ORCID records of your researchers and other data. It's possible to also add affiliation and other data. And you can also include person updates and collect permissions to update the biographical section of the ORCID record. For example, if you want to add a link to a website, if you want to push another identifier, keywords, and more. Whenever an integration writes an item on an ORCID record, our API returns a put code, which is a 5 or 6 digit code that identifies that item on the ORCID record, and we recommend that you store it because if you want to edit that item, you'll need the put code for your API call. And if you're going to share and connect outputs data into the ORCID registry, we have some minimum metadata requirements like the title, the work type, and also a work identifier. We support many different identifiers for works or contributions like DOIs, handles, and more. And to mention that there are some integrations already made, already enabled that you could use. Brocadi is a repository system developed by the University of Antwerp, and they have an ORCID integration that allows to collect IDs and to connect or write data into the ORCID registry. DSpace currently doesn't have an enabled integration, but the colleagues from KAUST have shared their solution during Open Access Week 2019. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm sure Daryl will explain, but sharing the links to the solution here. ePrints, also an open source system, has an ORCID Advanced plugin that allows to use the member API and collect IDs and write data to records. Figshare is another very popular repository system. They don't have a direct integration with ORCID, but it's possible if you're using Figshare, it's possible for that metadata to be connected to the ORCID registry via DataSite, and for this it's important and needed that the IDs are embedded in the metadata. This is a user-enabled process, meaning the user needs to grant permission for DataSite to write data on that ORCID ID or on that ORCID record, and then whenever there's a DOI issued with Figshare, and when that ID has been connected, then DataSite can push that data into the ORCID record. Haplo is another open source system. They also have an integration that allows for users to connect the ID and allows to write the works metadata into the ORCID record. Islandora has an integration. This integration currently only allows to log in to Islandora with ORCID, and it also collects authenticated IDs, but currently it doesn't allow the push. We hope this can be developed soon. And Zenodo, if you use Zenodo for your collections, the workflow that applies is the same as in Figshare. If the ID is added to the metadata, and if users have allowed DataSite to connect data, then it's possible for this metadata to be connected to the ORCID record. And also a user-enabled solution is for users to import their works, their contributions, data from Base into ORCID. Base harvests and indexes many different kind of open access outputs, and they have built a search and link wizard with ORCID. So users can import outputs from institutional repositories and other sources by entering in their ORCID record and then importing directly from Base. Sharing some custom integrations, best practices. So if you're using a system that still hasn't enabled an integration, a direct integration with the ORCID, we recommend that you request sandbox credentials and start testing the ORCID API in the sandbox, and this is available for free to everyone, both for institutions and for service providers. We also have some recommended workflow for integration with repository systems, and we recommend that you check the documentation when you start planning and developing your integration. And obviously that you share, once the integration is complete, that you share and communicate any relevant documentation and instructions with the community. And if you have a use case of an integration, an ORCID integration in repositories, please make sure you share your use case. There's a wiki in the Libsensé Raken website, and we'd like to share many use cases with the community. And with this, I'll end my presentation and hand over to Daryl. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gabi. It was excellent.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, thanks, Daryl.
Okay. So I'm going to focus mostly on what we are doing here at KAUST, but I'll talk a little bit at the beginning about DSpace in general. And as Gabi mentioned, there's not really a full support for ORCID in the regular DSpace. There is a function where you can, when you're submitting an item or editing an item, you can connect an ORCID ID to an author name, but it's pretty limited functionality. And even in the newer version of DSpace, there won't be any big changes to that part. There is another version of DSpace called DSpace Chris that does have more full ORCID support, and actually it's got a lot of different features here. At KAUST, we decided not to move to DSpace Chris. We stayed with the main version of DSpace, and instead we did some local customizations, and we set up a separate tool to work with the DSpace REST API and with the ORCID API. So the first part that we have is the customizations to the main DSpace. So for DSpace 5 and 6, and it's released as a patch. One of the effects that would come from installing this would be that the ORCID ID, the icon would display next to the author name on an item page, which isn't in the default for DSpace. It also allows search by ORCID ID and management of the ORCID IDs through the REST API, including of the names connected to the ORCID ID in DSpace. Then mostly what I'll talk about is this separate tool that we have developed that we run, which we call our institutional ORCID integration. It's kind of an intermediary between DSpace and ORCID. It has a lot of kind of local features that are helpful for communicating with users and for knowing like how many people in the institution are using ORCID, things like that. We run it at KAUST as an internal service, so it's just within our network, and it uses the local authentication. So it's pretty relatively lightweight, mostly just focused on helping people manage this connection between DSpace and ORCID. For a user who logs in to the local integration, they can identify their ORCID ID, they can grant permissions. So this would be like to send information to ORCID, for example. Then they can select what they want transferred, and they can update and manage the permissions and remove something that they previously transferred to ORCID, or unlink something that they previously linked to their ORCID in DSpace. Link or unlink. And then from the administrative side, you can upload information about the people in your institution. So you can have different groups of people. Students, postdocs, and faculty are the ones that we track. And you can send invitations. So there's an interface where you can say, okay, how many people do I have in the student group that have never been sent an invitation email? And then you click and you send invitation emails to each of them. That's a kind of customized email a little bit with links to the ORCID integration and an explanation about it. And then there's another option where you can send a follow-up email for just the people who didn't use the integration from the first email. So there's some management functionalities that are helpful. Then, yeah, correcting name errors. There's a function where you can. So one thing you see often with people on their ORCID record, they may enter their name in an unusual way. So, for example, all caps or including their job title, or and it could also be that when they first use our integration, the name that we send to ORCID is the name that is listed in the university system, which may not be the exact name that they want displayed on their publications. So then the other function for kind of administrators in the tool is to see a dashboard of how many people have used the tool from different groups and what permissions they've given. It also has a kind of a query service where another system in the university can send the local person identifier for someone, the university ID number, and get back the ORCID ID or the list of publications connected to that ORCID ID in the repository. So that's used in KAUST for the faculty annual reporting process, where the faculty submit their yearly report and they import their publication list from the repository service. And that connection is based through this tool by the annual report system sends their university ID number to our system, and we send back their publication list for that year. We've set it up so you can kind of configure it to work in a few different ways. The way that we use it is the main scenario, the first one. So you're an ORCID member and you have a DSpace repository, but it would also work in these alternate scenarios. So if you're not an ORCID member, but you have a DSpace repository, you can use this for people to authenticate the ORCID ID that they're adding to items in the DSpace repository. Or if you are an ORCID member institution, but you don't have a DSpace repository, you could potentially use this just for managing the institutional affiliation on the ORCID records. So for sending information that says this person is a student at this university starting from this date, that kind of information. I thought I would go through quickly the second scenario, which I thought might apply to the most people. So this would be your institution is not an ORCID member, but you would like to, but you have a DSpace repository and you want to have ORCID IDs in that repository and then have people manage them through this tool. So in that case, first you need to do the DSpace patching, which I didn't cover here, but there is some documentation at that earlier link. Then so your DSpace is ready, and then you go to this second tool, the institutional ORCID integration, and you want to set it up. You have your server, you have the code downloaded. The credentials that you'll need from ORCID will be the public API credentials that Gabi mentioned. This is just a screenshot of the form. The one thing kind of that we'll come back to is the redirect URI, which is the URL that your service has. So when you you have your service, you send them to ORCID to authenticate, and then ORCID needs to send them back to your service. So ORCID needs to know where to send them back to. And that's, so you need to have that. And I've done it, I think, where it's just on a test system. It can be like the local host, and that will work fine for testing. And so, yeah, test it in the sandbox first, of course. In the institutional ORCID integration configuration file, this is what it would look like when you're setting it up. So it would say ORCID member is false, and while you're in the sandbox, you would say ORCID production false. Then after you had filled in that form in the previous slide on the ORCID side, you would get back a OAuth client ID and an OAuth client secret that you would enter here. And then this redirect URI will be the same one that you entered in that form previously. So then when a user comes and you have your LDAP, your local Active Directory authentication set up, they log in, they will have this option first to create or identify your ORCID ID. And so in this case, where you're not an ORCID member, the only kind of permissions they can give is this identification, authentication permissions. Then what they're doing here is they're managing the relationship to the publications with their name that are in the repository. And you can select an item or unselect it if you don't want it connected to your ORCID ID, or if it's for someone with the same name as you or something. Then you come back and you have confirmation of your ORCID ID. And later, if you come back to the service, you'll get this manage permissions page. So like in the first scenario, like at KAUST, this is where if someone gave permission before for you to update their ORCID record and now they want to remove that permission, they would do that here. Or if in the beginning they only said, I want to give authenticate permission, but not the other permissions, you do that here. But here in this case, there's only one permission and it's the authenticate permission. So nothing is changed, can be changed really. But there's also the history option where they can see their items in the repository, and then they can review and edit those items. And it's also would link to the repository. So like if you click this link, then you would see this is on a test DSpace 6 version. This would take you to a search by the ORCID ID, and it would list the items matching that ORCID ID. And then on the main effect of this whole process would be that in the DSpace repository now, the username would be displayed with the ORCID ID icon, which links out to the ORCID record. And the name would be displayed as a link to an internal search in DSpace for all the items with that ORCID ID. Okay, so that's all I was going to cover. We'll go on next, I think, to Marié. And I guess if there are questions, you can ask me later.
Thanks a lot, Daryl. That was very useful.
Hello, everybody. Good morning still. I assume you can see my screen now. Oh, I'm not at the right spot, sorry. Just get to the start of the Good, here we are. So it's a very humbling experience now to talk just after Daryl and their integration at KAUST with their repository. It's actually for me the blueprint of what you can do with DSpace, and you will see we haven't been able to do that yet. So our very small integration that I will talk about is not nearly as impressive. But yeah, on this slide, I'm just quickly going to point out that we implemented our integration in March 2016, and clients are able to create and or connect their ORCID records with their Stellenbosch University identity. And it's only the first step to store access tokens for future integrations, read and write permissions. So unfortunately, there are no other integrations available yet that actually integrate with a system at the university. So, so this is how it will look. It's on our staff portal, and you will sign in with your credentials on the portal and then see this page. And in my case, I'm already linked, so you can see it shows linked. And if you're not linked, it will just have a red not linked sign here, and then the button here will say connect, and it will take you through all the steps to connect your ID or create your ID from scratch and connect it with the university at the same time. And like I said, we do ask permission for read and write permission from the clients then. Right, so this is just in a nutshell what we have. Just want to get rid of this thingy for me. I can't see. Okay, good. So if we look at the numbers, at the end of last year, December 2020, if we look at the ORCID stats that they supply, the clients that have created with their Stellenbosch University email addresses and ORCID ID were about 4,240 at that point of time. And those who have connected their IDs with the integration was about 1,936 at that time. You will see in this graph how it has grown over the years from 2016 and onwards. But you will also see it's not even half of those who already have ORCID IDs that have connected it with this integration of ours. So this is just a quick slide to show you the numbers according to the client categories and the faculties. The client category, you will see the academic staff is quite a good number for our academic staff, and the reason is because we focus our marketing efforts on academics and researchers. And the others are quite, or you will see there's even undergraduate students, a few honor students, and then mostly PhDs and master students. The reason why those are also not quite good is because the National Research Foundation in South Africa has mandated the use of ORCID when students apply for funding. So that means that they have to have an ORCID ID when they apply for funding in South Africa, and this might mean that people go to our integration to create the ORCID IDs if they know about it. So this is just a quick slide on that. Then to show you the sorry, what have I done now? The situation in South Africa. We have a consortium that's run by Tenet, and they supply us these slides every year with how the numbers look in South Africa. We have every year an ORCID workshop, like in October or November every year, and then they will supply these numbers for us as well. And you will see in 2019, our Stellenbosch University here on the left-hand side, we're at the top of it. We had the most created IDs in the country at that point of time. You can see the University of Witwatersrand was also doing quite well. But then these changed a bit in 2020. This is the slide we received from them in 2020. And you will see Stellenbosch is now not at the top anymore, but just to say we're not the biggest university in the country. The University of Witwatersrand, Pretoria, University of Cape Town, all of those are are bigger universities with many more students. But here you will see the biggest growth in this year was from University of Cape Town and University of KwaZulu-Natal. And the reason for this came out in the workshop we had last year. And it was because both of them implemented conveyors during that year, which is a CRIS system. And of course, it also fully integrated with ORCID. So that was the reason for that big growth in the at the universities. Then just to go over to a few slides about how we market ORCID on our campus. We try to really have quite a marketing campaign every year, like marketing drives with a specific topic and a specific way in how we try to market both ORCID and the integration. We also have an information sheet that we distribute, a library guide, of course, where we put all the important information on. We have a blog for research news, library research news, where we will highlight all the important aspects of ORCID. The faculty librarians will have one-on-one sessions with their researchers. We use the Division for Research Development's newsletter, which is a very good way in distributing our news about ORCID. And yes, as I said, the marketing drives we have every year. We are now planning the next one for 2021 will be mid-June, hopefully. Yeah, and then just to look a bit into the future, or to say what we have at the moment, we use open journal systems, the open journal system for our open access journals on campus, and we host 26 journals in this system. And some of them do require an ORCID ID with submission of articles, and it has an ORCID plugin, the version that we use at the moment. Then, of course, to get to the repository, we are using DSpace. Our institutional repository is called Sun Scholar, and like Daryl has also explained before, that version 7 will include a tighter integration with external identifier systems as ORCID, but it's not a full integration to push and pull information. So at this point, we are still just there. We're still on version 6 of DSpace. And yeah, there's no other integration with the repository. Figshare, we launched our institutional research data repository in August 2019. And of course, like he has also explained, Figshare is integrated with ORCID. I think that was Gabriela who mentioned that. But it's also not such a fully integrated integration. Then there's also a new system that we're still developing on campus, Sun Student. And I think they've proceeded quite far, but I don't think it's quite completed yet. And with Sun Student, it might be possible to mandate the inclusion of ORCID IDs when students set up their profiles for thesis and dissertation submission. And so this will be considered for adoption in this new system, hopefully. Right, but then the last slide, I know we are short of time, so I'm just quickly going to talk about the challenges. like I said, we're not nearly as advanced as some other places, so there are challenges. So why is it so difficult to promote our integration? You will see, you've seen with the numbers that not even half of those who have ORCID IDs have connected it to the Stellenbosch integration. But it's because there's not really a full integration with any system yet. It's only storage to the access of those IDs that we do at the moment. So the other challenge we have is that Stellenbosch University doesn't have a current research information system currently. Chris, like I said, you've seen the growth of UCT and UKZN's ORCID adoption when they've implemented Converus, and yeah, we don't have that yet. I know the Division for Research Development is looking into acquiring some other system, but we're not sure yet what it will be. Then, of course, the third challenge is always staff time. Unfortunately, we know about the KAUST code that they've made available to enhance the DSpace integration, but due to capacity issues, we weren't able to do this yet. Then another challenge is the communication across campus. All faculties and all support services need to know about our integration and how to refer students and staff accordingly. So when there's, say for example, in the Division for Research Development, there's someone working with the National Research Foundation applications, and if there's a new person that doesn't know about our integration, they will just refer people straight to the ORCID website and not to the integration part, and that's where our problems sometimes come in. All right, then it's important to change our marketing strategies often. It doesn't help to just send out reminders by email or so. We need a fresh approach each time we have a marketing drive, highlight different aspects during different marketing drives. For example, last year we created a video on how to populate the ORCID record, and then that was our approach with our marketing that year, was to talk about how to populate your ORCID record. So that is just an example. This year we will try to have another angle and another approach to have it like with a fresh type of look and feel as well. Then the last challenge is how to close that gap between the registered ORCID IDs that exist already on campus and those who have connected it to the Stellenbosch integration. And it will be helpful to identify those who haven't done so yet and target them specifically. But yeah, that might be quite a task to do. So I will stop here. This is my slides, and then you're welcome to ask questions afterwards. So now we will hand over to the next presenter. That will be Roberto.
Yes.
Am I correct? Yes, thanks.
Marié, can you stop sharing slides?
Yes,
so that
I will do so.
Thank you very much.
If I can just get the correct button, there you are.
Yes, okay. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to Irina and the organizer for giving me the opportunity to share the experiences I got from Ethiopia and Somali on development of institutional repositories and connections with persistent identifiers and ORCID among them. So today I'll briefly introduce the concept, then I'll talk about the disability problem, and then I'll show you the experiences and the lessons we learned working with two institutional repositories, national repositories, one in Ethiopia and the other one in Somalia. And then I'll come to the summary and conclusions. So if you look at the world, from these different perspectives, and one perspective is the number of scientific papers published with authors from each countries, you see that the relative sizes of the continents are very uneven, very different from the normal view. A few years ago, in the context of an European funded project, we built a knowledge base of repositories of open access, open data, and open educational repositories. And you may see very easily that very few are coming from Africa, and even less if you require that the repository fulfill or comply with the FAIR principles. It is not surprising that if you look at the number of open access policies in the different parts of the world, again, Africa has the least number of policies in place in its countries. So there is a visibility problem of African researchers and African researchers. And in our experience, one possibility to tackle this problem is to promote and spread a coherent use or persistent identifier. When I talk about persistent identifier, I mean persistent identifier for researchers, for research outputs, and for research organizations. And in these three contexts, of course, what's emerging is ORCID for persistent identifiers for researchers, DataCite for research outputs, and ROR for research organizations. And in this presentation, I will concentrate mainly on these two providers of persistent identifiers. So, in order to spread the importance and the adoption of persistent identifiers, we got two opportunities. In 2017, in the context of the project I mentioned before, my university established an agreement with the Conference of Italian University Rectors to extend the possibility to provide DOI prefixes to African organizations wishing to deploy an institutional access to repositories. And at that time, 4 prefixes were released. The situation has improved, and now in 2021, the UbuntuNet Alliance has become a DataCite member, and all the other organizations owning DOI prefix are now directly supported by DataCite. And if you are interested in becoming a DataCite member and explore the different types of memberships, you can visit the address. Another opportunity was the fact that 3 years ago, we took the Zenodo code and the Invenio version 3 code, and we modified in a way that the repository was more easily installable and deployable outside CERN. And we first implemented the open access repository for the Italian National Institute of Nuclear Physics, but we spent quite some time to make the installation easy to make and replicable. And in the context of two separate projects, we supported the deployment of a national academic digital repository in Ethiopia, and the other one in Somalia, and I'll come back to that later. So the objectives of NADRE was again to increase the access to academic and scientific publications, but also to increase the visibility of Ethiopian researchers and Ethiopian research output, and to foster the paradigm of open science and also the use of open licenses and digital object identifiers. So NADRE adopts leading-edge technologies, and using the concept of communities, which is central in Zenodo, we have already deployed, really created one community, at least one community per each of the universities in the country. And the repository is compliant with the FAIR principle and is compliant with the Plan S requirements. And we complemented the technical activities with a huge series of training and tutoring activities. So we ran several events all over Ethiopia, and though we had hundreds of people, hundreds of researchers and teachers, but also librarians and staff participating in these events. And during these events, we promoted the creation of ORCID IDs. And at that time, we created more than 300 ORCID IDs that were basically unknown in the country at that time. By far, the most important success of NADRE is the fact that it triggered the creation of the national open access policy in Ethiopia for higher education. The document is available in the NADRE itself, but what's important is that from a very top-down approach, the policy has been written by the Minister of Science and Higher Education. It promotes the use of persistent identifiers and the names ORCID IDs among the most important persistent identifiers. So really a huge results, a very important results that make the adoption of these persistent identifiers sustainable in the long term. As I said, besides NADRE in Ethiopia, we are also supporting since I would say 7-8 months the deployment of the Somali Research and Education Repository, which is another national repository. The background, I mean, in Somalia there is a gap in production of scientific results, but also a visibility problem. And all the universities and research organizations are committed to close this gap and make Somali research outputs and Somali researchers more visible. They tried with DSpace, but the problem was the support from external resources to implement the system. And they want to address the lack of localized open access research, overcome the limited research output visibility, and improve the quality of research, also fighting against plagiarism. So we deployed a twin of NADRE in Somalia. This is very recent activities. They already ran 2 introduction events with heads of the ministry and heads of the universities. And we already created 10 different communities. They are now working on a huge national launch event to promote the adoption. And they are also brainstorming about a national policy to enforce the use of the repository for all the scientific publications in the country. And as this was the case for the INFN Open Access Repository and the NADRE repository in Ethiopia, we are exploiting the concept of communities to open the Somali repository, also to non-Somali users. I mean, users coming from Somaliland, which is the National Research Networks, but also from other Somali universities. So we are, I mean, they want to be able to store scientific outputs coming also from other countries where no repositories are available. There is a seamless integration with ORCID in the sense that Gabriela mentioned before. We tried to push ORCID adoption in different ways. First of all, we enabled, I mean, this comes with Zenodo, and we also supported this in the new, in the revised version of the software, where we also enabled federated authentication. And we also support single sign-on with ORCID ID. And we aim at promoting ORCID as an identity provider. So people start using ORCID not only to store their publications, but they know that their ORCID credentials that can be used to access open access repositories and other open science related services. And on the other hand, we have specific metadata in the upload form. So when you upload a document, people can spell out and include the ORCID IDs. And this can be done manually, but also using the programming interface of Zenodo and Invenio. From the other side, as Gabriela said in the first presentation, we support the ORCID integration through the fact that when you go to your ORCID profile and you look for your own works, you can select the data site as a persistent identifier provider, and then you can connect ORCID with get an ORCID token to connect with the Somali research repository. For example, you can authorize access, and then you can upload your record, fetch your publication stored on the Somali research repository, and automatically include in your ORCID profile. So let me summarize. Persistent identifiers, as I said, and I hope I try to show you, like data site, like ORCID, like Roux, can play a key role in increasing visibility of researchers and research outputs, especially in the African continent, where we have seen there is a gap. From the technical point of view, the approach we took is to deploy digital repository and connect them to providers of persistent identifiers. So we exploited Zenodo and Invenio, and we connected to ORCID and a data site. From the education point of view, we decided to promote open access and open science, digital repositories, and persistent identifiers all on the same basis to show the importance of all these elements. And we spent a lot of time to train researchers to use repositories, but also to create their own identifiers. Last but not least, of course, from the policy point of view, to make digital repositories and persistent identifiers sustainable in the long term, the only way is to include them in national policies. We managed this very successfully in Ethiopia, and we are trying to do the same in Somalia. So that's my slides. I would like to thank you very much, and I'm eager to get your questions. If some of you have already registered, I remind the brokerage event that we will be running at the Open Repositories Conference in less than 2 weeks, where we will also run a tutorial on how to use these repositories, connect data site identifiers and ORCID profiles. So that's it. I think I can stop sharing and give back the floor to Gabriela. Please, Gabriela.
Thank you so much, Roberto, for your presentation and for speaking in a broader sense of the importance of persistent identifiers, not only for increasing visibility for research outputs, but also to foster open science and open research practices. And thanks so much, Marié and Daryl as well. I'm going to check the Q&A section. So if you haven't yet posted your questions, please ask your questions on the Q&A functionality. I'm going to start with a question asking between the integration between ORCID and Mendeley, and what the features of this integration are. So Mendeley integrates ORCID and allows to connect an ID, and they also allow to import data from ORCID into Mendeley, including peer-reviewed data. So let me share this link on the chat with more information, and I hope that answers the question. Then there's another question. How do I know whether my ORCID ID has been authenticated? That's a really great question. So for users, you'll know whether an ID has been authenticated because you will see a page, and I think Daryl, you've displayed this authorization screen in one of your slides. If not, let me share another example. But for users, you'll see the ORCID page, and you'll be prompted or requested to enter your email address and password to sign into your ORCID record. And then you'll have another page asking you to permissions to get that ORCID ID, permissions to read data, or permissions to write data. So, and I'll try to find a screenshot so that you can see this process, and I'll share on the chat box. And thank you so much for the question. And there was another question. How can I see the number of researchers at my institution? And Nabil has shared a link. It's possible to look, to do an API query and look or search by email address. Please remember that most of the email addresses on the ORCID registry are marked as private. Whenever a user registers, because we are GDPR compliant, the email address is marked as private by default. And it's also possible to look, use the API to look or search by institutional name, and you can retrieve the data also in a CSV file. And the link has been shared, so thank you so much. And I think that's the last question. There's another question to get the slides. And yes, slides and recording will be shared with all the registrant. So you'll receive the recording and the slides per email. And if there are no questions, I have one question for all of you, Roberto, Marié, and Daryl, as you've integrated ORCID yourselves in your repositories. So I would like to ask you if you could give one advice to other organizations that are starting to plan their integrations, their ORCID integrations in repositories, what that advice would be. Daryl, if you would like to go first.
One advice, sorry, I wasn't ready for that. I think the main thing for us was to have all of the different university stakeholders informed. So like, especially the offices that dealt with the research evaluation process, and all of the different people, especially who are interested in getting publication lists. There's lots of people in the university, they want to know, like, for each person, what did they publish in the last year or whatever, and they were very strong supporters for our work. So I think find those people, and then you'll find the support in the institution to do the work that you need to do.
Thank you so much, Daryl. And Marié, what would be your advice?
Yes, I think in our case, maybe to have time because we had to register a project with our main IT division on campus to assist us with the integration and it takes some time to get it done and register first the project, and then so have time. You don't you feel rushed maybe.
Well, my take-home message is to combine the top-down approach with the bottom-up one, and show users mean students, teachers, the staff, the full picture. So persistent identifiers are part of a bigger picture towards the adoption of the open science paradigm, or at least the open access paradigm. So I think that we can convince people to create ORCID IDs if they understand that this is easy, and this is useful.
Thank you so much. So to summarize, both getting institutional support and develop cross-institutional collaboration, plan time dedication, and combining both top-down and bottom-up approach, and very important, as Roberto said, promote and work on building awareness about the importance of persistent identifiers for open science and research. I don't see any questions, so I think we can wrap up the session and close here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and hope to see you again soon. And thank you so much for
Bye-bye, everybody.
the fellow speakers. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.